Area Climate Adaptation Network, been around for about a year and a half. Let's go to the next slide. And we're part of a larger network of networks, the Alliance of Regional Collaboratives for Climate Adaptation, which is not quite California-wide, but aiming for that. There's actually, this map is going to be superseded soon enough with a couple of additional network partners. And so we're a network of networks. BayCAN is, at this point, I think the newest kid on the block. And we're doing what you all do on the subject that you all work on, climate adaptation. Given that it's a new space, it relatively new for, in terms of the policy world, collaboration is obviously of critical importance, and we needed a collaborative network in the Bay Area, and we have one now with BayCAN. We're really focused on local government, though we have members from a variety of places. We're up to about 38 members now, including all of the three largest cities in the Bay Area and many other cities and towns, 7 of the 9 counties, and a number of community organizations as well. We're not everybody because we have a dues-based structure to support ourselves financially that's worked pretty well right now, though it wasn't easy to implement. And we're working on a variety of climate adaptation related issues. Next slide. This is our mission statement coming up here. And it is adaptation focused. It's focused on helping Bay Area local governments respond effectively and equitably to the impacts of climate change. So we all know what that's about, and equity, you can see, is in our mission statement there. The premise here, in part, is that adaptation is going to be disruptive. I spend a lot of time focusing on sea level rise. That's just one of many issues that's going to be incredibly disruptive to our communities. And the thinking is that we need to be prepared for that in a variety of different ways. The good thing about adaptation is there's time to a large extent to prepare and to put in place measures that will make us adaptive. And we should be using that time to do it right, and we have that time. Whether worst case scenarios or best case scenarios come true, it's going to be disruptive, and we need to spend the time doing it right. And equity is clearly one of the places where focus needs to be devoted so that we're ensuring that our most vulnerable communities don't take the brunt of the disruption that is inevitable and coming. Next slide, please. I'm not going to go over this in detail, but this was one of the things that we did. We don't have a lot of meetings. We have 2 large regional meetings a year and 2 sub-regional meetings a year. This was a panel that Yeshi put together after consulting a number of experts in the Bay Area and elsewhere that kind of introduced the idea of equitable planning around adaptation, not really for the first time to our members, but significantly in the BayCAN network. A lot of the time was spent talking about why this was important in this panel, and we got a lot of comment back that said, yes, we know that it's important. Now let's talk about how to do it right. Next slide. How to do it right is coming up extensively in our equity work group. So this is our organizational structure. We got BayCAN at the top. We have one work group, which is the equity work group that we launched. We're actually getting ready to launch a couple of others. One is on the public safety power shutoffs, which of course has an equity component to them when the utility shuts down power preventively to prevent fires. Another is going to be assessment to adaptation. How do we go from vulnerability assessment to actually planning adaptation? But the first one we launched was the equity work group. And as I said, it's time to start thinking about that now before the bulk of the biggest disruptions take place. So that's where we're at with BayCAN, and I'll hand it to Yeshi now to talk about the details of where we're going in the work group and elsewhere.
Yeah, thank you, David. I think that helps set us up really well for understanding what the function of this work group really is for us as a network. So if we can go to the next slide. So what we are we are a collaborative work group that sorry, let me back up. So we formed an equity work group as a way to address how to embed equity into our network to begin with. And this work group is a collaborative space that convenes BayCAN members and partners on a bi-monthly basis to meet both of our two goals, which we have listed up here. One is to act as a space for BayCAN members to advance equity within their existing and future adaptation initiatives through knowledge sharing and brainstorming, fostering an environment of community of practice in which members learn together. And this can look like a couple different things. This could look like bringing in presentations and resources for members, having topic-specific breakout groups, making commitments for action, and supporting one another through follow-through. These are some of the ways in which we'll be actually fostering that community of practice together. And then really to meet our second goal, which is to provide a venue for interested parties to collaboratively explore what approaches BayCAN itself could take to advance equity as the network continues to evolve. So what are we doing within to maintain equitable process and best practice in our format and our structure as a network itself? And so this could look like bringing equity resources and education to BayCAN's broader membership through trainings, webinars, presentations at our regional meetings, really embedding and expanding the equity resources, not just to the people in the work group, but to the network as a whole. And the idea being that the work group would be the space to determine what those resources and trainings would look like, because the folks in the work group are the ones that are probably thinking more concretely about this and would know what the rest of the network might benefit from. And then another example of this would be looking at BayCAN's internal structures and providing recommendations to the steering committee regarding how to make them more inclusive and equitable. That's one example of what the work group is beginning to do. It's meant to be a space to set the culture internally of what are we doing as a network to make sure we're equitable in process. So next slide. So I will touch a bit on where we are now. This is a picture of our first launch meeting in July of the work group, exactly a year after BayCAN itself launched. We had our next July meeting the following year in which we launched our equity work group. And we've only had 3 meetings so far, one in July, one in September, and one in November. And they've been all really successful in different ways. Our first meeting was really spent doing culture building, relationship building, and setting community agreements. And following meetings included coming up with shared definitions of equity. We had a subgroup meet in between meetings to come up with a definitional document of how are we defining equity as a work group, so that we're operating under a shared sense of understanding of what equity even means, and defining climate justice within that. And that's something I'd be happy to share if people are interested in seeing. We also work to set priorities and get to know where we all are with our equity work, similar to as we did in our opening round of introductions. And we've been coming up with concrete project ideas and beginning to self-organize under those project ideas. And I'll share a little bit at the end of the presentation around what our next steps and our projects as a work group are going to be. Next slide. So really what I'll be spending the bulk of this presentation talking about is discussing the process by which we actually got to this point, which was a year in the making. And I think it's worth discussing because we really took our time and the upstart of the visioning process, because one of the most fundamental components of equitable best practice is embedding equity and meaningful community involvement into the very planning process itself. So it didn't make sense for us to just start a work group or to begin an equity initiative without first really ground truthing and understanding what is equitable best practice. How do we do this in the right way? Who needs to be at the table for us to do this planning in an equitable way? Next slide. So to begin with, the phase 1 of this upstart process was our landscape research phase. When we first entered this process, we didn't know the best way to begin embedding equity into our scope of work as a network. So in order to get a better sense of what equitable best practices look like within local government and adaptation spaces, we engaged in a comprehensive landscape research process in which we interviewed dozens of community leaders, adaptation planners, and climate justice advocates. And from these interviews, it became clear that there is a need not just to bring equity and racial justice trainings and resources into our membership, but also examine the structures by which we operate to begin with as a network. And we realized that BayCAN staff weren't equipped, nor would it necessarily be appropriate for us to determine the ways in which we might bring equity-focused resources and structural shifts to our network. We needed a collaborative space to begin together, both within our existing membership, as well as community members and equity advocates, to be a part of any planning and programmatic shifts we may make as a network. So this is sort of where the idea of forming a work group was formed, not to just form a climate justice program, but to form a work group to do that collaborative decision making together in the spirit of being a collaborative network, which is what we are as BayCAN. Next slide. So along this line, another takeaway from our landscape research and interview phase was the constant emphasis that we got from the folks that we were talking to about the importance of advancing equity at the procedural as well as the distributional level. And so this is where I'm going to bring in some key best practices that we learned through our Upstart process last year. And this is best practice number 1. And what this means is, for example, in adaptation planning, while it's important to prioritize and fairly distribute resources to the most vulnerable communities, which is what we'd probably call distributional equity, the process by which you engage the communities in the planning itself, through the structures of decision making, through community engagement processes, all that, it's equally important. And that's what we would call procedural equity. So this applied to BayCAN as well. While we knew that we were trying to produce a work group that could bring equitable programs to BayCAN, we needed to embed collaborative decision-making processes into the work group itself and the formation of the work group in a way in which we planned that we needed to plan this so that the work group could both evolve equitably and embed community partnership in the planning and output of what the work group would produce. Next slide. So to do this from the very beginning, we formed a planning team, and this was made up of existing BayCAN members in which we discussed the nature of the work group we wanted to form, and we wrote proposals which we presented at sub-regional meetings to make sure that we had support from the broader membership. For perhaps most importantly, we figured out that the best way in which to work in partnership with community members would be through the planning process itself, because we knew that there'd be no way to equitably launch a work group without doing so in partnership with community, in which they would write the proposals with us and design the agendas for meetings. And we needed this to happen from the very first one. And so it was really helpful to have a planning team to both decide collaboratively that that was something we valued in the launch of the work group, and then also to begin finding resources to actually make that happen. Next slide. And we did this because of what I'm introducing as equity best practice number 2, which is to include meaningful community involvement at every level of the decision-making process. And that's from the ideation phase to the planning phase to the implementation phase. They need to be there for all of it if possible. And in some ways, admittedly, it would have been best if we could have had our partners there from the very first planning team meeting and not just have our original planning team just up of existing network members. But we needed to internally first figure out how we could secure funding to pay these community partners to work with us, as well as to decide collectively that this was something we valued. Next slide. So this leads me to the best practice number 3 that I offer, which is to always pay community members and equity leaders for their work. And this is something that came through time and time again in our landscape research phase. They should not be supplying free labor in any partnerships you form. And while you'd not necessarily pay a project partner at another government agency, for example, in our case, the situation is definitely different for community-based organizations and folks working directly in grassroots groups. They're underpaid and overworked and need to be compensated for their time. And so this was directly relevant for us as we wanted to bring community partners into our formation phase, because we knew we needed to pay them. But as a new organization, we also needed to find funding to do that. And that was sort of the value of forming the planning team. Next slide. So that did become the next phase of our process was, okay, let's hire some community partners. We were able to write money into the budget to do so from the beginning, which was amazing. And the planning team made the case for this. And basically, through the integrating that line item into the budget for the next fiscal year, we were able to pay 2 community partners to join us in the final planning phases of the work group, and then to partner through the year in meeting and planning the entire work group process, as well as being facilitators at the meetings themselves. One comes from an environmental justice community-based organization called the West Oakland Environmental Indicators Project. And so they're one of our partners in the work group to this day. And the other used to work for this organization called the Environmental Justice Coalition for Water, and then made her own equity consulting business. And she was our second partner. Now she's actually working for a regional agency and is stepping down from her community partner role, but will still be advising us. But we still have one community partner from this grassroots group. And they've both done an amazing job so far in helping us launch the work group and hold successful meetings and really ground truth, what we need to be doing as a work group to make it equitable. And just an important note that I want to make on this end is that our partners aren't meant to represent their entire communities or have to act as mouthpieces for all those affected by climate injustice. We view their partnership as a beginning point in a larger process to work more deeply with communities across the Bay and widen our circles of collaboration. For now, they're just helping us act as bridges to begin building those relationships and scaling up this effort to ground truth our discussions when necessary, but they're by no means representatives of all frontline communities. Next slide. So this really gets us to where we are now. That was the arc of how we formed our work group. And with having those community partners, that really was the key to stepping into starting to hold the meetings and build the agendas and begin facilitating really wonderful work group meetings. And like I said before, we've had 3 so far. And we are continuing to build our community-based organization membership in BayCAN. We've got around 5 or 6 community-based organizations that come to the work group meetings regularly. And we had to go through an entire process to write a policy to make sure that they would not have to pay dues to be members in BayCAN to begin with. And so that was one structural process that we had to go through. And then another was after Nahal actually stepped down, one of our community organizations, she stepped down as a paid consultant. We actually had some extra money that we were able to now allocate actually directly to the community-based organizations that we have in our work group to pay them small stipends to both attend work group meetings as well as regional meetings, again, adhering to that best practice of paying community organizations for their participation, knowing that it mutually benefits them as well as the rest of the membership and having that really integral community perspective at the table. So next slide. Just to say a little bit about what's coming up next for us, we have hopefully a webinar coming up in January. David, we still need to talk about the specifics, but the idea is potentially to have a webinar in which we'll bring together BayCAN members specifically from local government that are already doing a lot of equity work in their organizations to give examples of best practices that they've learned and help our members learn what's been going on around the region in terms of embedding equity and adaptation planning. And then we'll have a February work group meeting as well as a regional meeting. That'll come right after our large regional meeting. And we're thinking about bringing training, smaller scale training to both our work group and then potentially a presentation from that presenter at the larger regional meeting. This is all within some of the goals that the work group has set to bring trainings and resources to the broader membership as well as the work group. We also identified a goal of the work group is to develop a toolkit of basically just really, we don't want to reinvent the wheel with all the resources that are out there, but there are certainly some key resources that could be put together in a larger toolkit of all of the different phases of embedding equity and adaptation, specifically at the local government level for our members, that we're going to compile as a work group that will be explicitly helpful and tailored to our members. And that might even include a matchmaking matrix in which we help our local government members match up with existing community-based initiatives and adaptation that are happening in their regions. So there's a lot of different ideas we have for that project. And we're going to have continued bi-monthly meetings for the rest of the fiscal year and likely beyond. And we do report backs at our sub-regional meetings as well, because we have North Bay, Central Bay, South Bay of our different sub-regions within our network. And so we bring equity report backs and resources to those meetings as well as broader grant research. We have a lot of more ambitious projects that we would love to undertake if we had more funding. And so that's a key piece of what the work group will be doing too, is looking to secure more funds to get more ambitious with our work. Next slide. So just to wrap us up, I wanted to recap some of the best practices that we learned in our Upstart process over the past year and a half, and that I think are helpful for anyone hoping to embed equity into their organization. Again, the equitable best practice number 1 that we learned was to advance equity at the procedural and distributional level. This ensures that your projects and plans fairly distribute resources and equitably impact all communities, with special care and consideration given to the most vulnerable to climate change. And then the second part of that is ensuring that the process by which you engage in a plan or a project meaningfully involves and equitably engages the most vulnerable communities. The second best practice that we learned is including meaningful community involvement at every level of the decision-making process, and really trusting that community members are experts about the needs of their own community. Best practice number 3 that we learned was to pay community members and equity leaders for their work, and to do one's best to find that funding sooner rather than later, which is something we really worked for, and it's starting to pay off in the relationships that we're building in our network and the trust that we're building with our CBOs. And the fourth best practice is to work intersectionally, and this is more one that, for me at least, was embedded throughout the work scope of forming the work group, was to consider the impact and potential disparities of our work on folks in terms of their race, class, gender identity, sexuality, age, ability. That vulnerability to climate change looks like a lot of different things depending on various life experiences. And finally, and this is just something that we are constantly navigating as a leadership team, BayCAN, particularly being an all-white leadership team, is to be aware of interpersonal power dynamics based on identity and privilege, and moving from a space of humility. And I'm continuing to do that work all the time. And we're continuing to learn and grow as a network and as a work group and as a leadership team. And this process is by no means over. And that's the point of the work group, is to continue to learn and grow together. And yeah, just to say, we don't have all the answers, but this has been our process of doing our best, muddling through, really embedding equity at every level as much as we could of our network and our decision-making processes. And we have high hopes for it to continue to grow and scale up, and we're already seeing some of the ripples through getting to share what we've learned and learn from you all in calls like this.
And we'll definitely reach out to you guys if other group members have questions that they want to explore with you. But thank you again for sharing what you guys have learned and your processes. I had a great time listening. So thank you all.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much for having us.
And happy holidays to everybody on the phone, and we will reconvene in January.
Thank you.